Okay. Hello. 5, August 5. Welcome to dis&dat information. We're going to return again to Anwar Sheikh's lectures on advanced political economy, largely from the text, his magnum opus, I would assume, 2016, uh, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crises. And it is, of course, a YouTube lecture, and varied. They are varied lectures, and they don't all occur in the same time frame. But they all are. They all are in order. There are 30 of them. We're only up to 7. Um, Now that we've returned from a little hiatus on this, I've included in this particular page on Medium the syllabus from at least the fall 2019 version of it. And I would note, of course, I am particularly amused, and partially because it's an idea I've had, um, and that is to deconstruct a standard textbook, because I think standard textbooks are the most uh, pernicious problems in at least economics. And maybe perhaps that's just sort of Samuelson envy of some kind, but um, I urge you to take a look at it. It does need to be sort of straightened out a bit, but I think it's important to consider these matters in the larger scheme of things. Anyway, I have set the speed of the lecture up slightly, simply to get us under the wire in terms of time. Other things are happening this evening, like the Red Hour. So uh, enjoy, as certain people refer to it. Uh-oh. Uh, Let us try this again. Hang in there.
That means that the argument I'm making, which I take straightforward from business literature and also in Marx, what I want to do today, and then later on Friday, is to talk about different theories of competition. So far I've been presenting what I consider to be the classical theory of competition. I want to ground that a little bit in quotes and references to Smith, Ricardo, Marx. And then I want to compare that to different post-classical theories of competition, beginning with people like Jevons and Walras, and then also talking, I'm going to skip Schumpeter and the Austrian economists. If you have questions, ask me, because I've got too much material here. The book will cover that in a lot of detail. But I want to make sure that I end up with the modern Marx monopoly school and Kalecki argument and the relationship between Keynes and Kalecki and the theory of real competition, because that's going to provide the grounding for macro analysis in the next semester. Then in the next lecture, I'm going to go through the empirical evidence. I'm going to show markup pricing and all the correlations and so on. Yep.
Are we going to study Marshall and Uno?
Unfortunately not. I'm going to focus on Walras because Walras plays such a big role in modern general equilibrium theory. In the book I do talk about Marshall. I don't have time to get into that there. I just looked at that chapter and that was 71 pages alone, so I have to cut something. But Uno, you will see some relation between Uno and the discussion of the American monopoly capitalism school, because there are some overlaps. However, Uno is a perfect paper topic for the course, which is to say, how does it relate to the theory of competition in Marx, and then the generalization of the idea that monopoly capitalism is a new stage. One of the things I'm going to argue against is that idea that monopoly capitalism is a new stage of capitalism. I think it's just a new stage of economic analysis because they forgot what competition really was like. And so I'm going to emphasize that point. This is a kind of memory problem. And more specifically, I'm going to point out that almost every version of monopoly capitalism theories in the Marxist and even in the Orthodox, but especially in the Marxist tradition, accept the notion of competition as taken from Jevons and Walras and others, so that they are really taking that to be representing some real process. But in order to get around the fact that it doesn't apply now, they say it used to apply in the past. And the root cause of that will be Hilferding, and from Hilferding to Lenin. And once it gets Lenin's stamp of approval, then everybody simply follows along. So the first thing I want to argue is that Hilferding was wrong, quite wrong about that. But to do this, I need to ground the argument a little bit to make sure that you understand that I'm not just making up what I think is the ideal representation of real competition. I'm trying to show that I can locate it in actual arguments made in the classical tradition. And then I'm going to move to the post-classical tradition. And of course, the modern post-Keynesian tradition will come in the end. So let me start with Smith. The central point in Smith's analysis is the understanding, as Schumpeter puts it, that free interaction of individual producers does not cause chaos but rather an orderly pattern. It's a very important point because the real essential argument in Smith is that people operate, firms and consumers operate independently, but rather than that independence leading to chaos, it leads to structured patterns. And that's, of course, the idea of the invisible hand. And the central ordering mechanism in Smith is competition. That's what creates the order out of the individual activities. And specifically, competition makes market wages of workers gravitate around some normal wage, which Smith calls a natural wage. It makes prices, profit rates gravitate around some normal rate, and therefore it makes prices correspond to some normal level, which he calls natural prices. And finally, it makes market rents gravitate around some normal level. So in Smith, these underlying gravitational centers of actual market variables are called natural. Now, he doesn't mean by natural in the sense of biology. He means that they are intrinsic to capitalism. And that's a point that is going to come up again several times in Ricardo and Marx. So from that point of view, if I look at wages, I'm looking at the market price, but underneath the wages, an invisible center of gravity, because it doesn't exist as such. When wages go above the natural level, they're brought back down, and they may shoot below it, so they gravitate around it. So these natural levels are not visible. They are gravitational centers, attractors, to use the modern terminology. And as such, they don't exist, except that the deviations from these levels put into motion forces that bring them back. For instance, what would make profit rates equalized? Well, we've talked about this before. If there's a high profit rate in one sector and a low profit rate in another sector, capital will flow more rapidly to the high profit rate, increasing supply relative to demand and bringing market price down. Here, in the opposite end, with a low profit rate, capital will slow down in its entry. So supply will slow down relative to demand, the market price will go up. And the movements to market prices is what establishes the equalization of profit rates. So it's not something that comes from the outside. It's the center of gravity of actually moving prices. In that sense, you expect that these prices will gravitate around each other because they're gravitating around the center. And so you could look for that to see if prices or profit rates move around some intrinsic center. Now, this center is not fixed because it depends on technology, depends on wages, it depends on international competition. So the center itself is moving, and the market prices are gravitating around that center. That's clear in Smith. So here's let me read you Smith's. On the whole, this is from Wealth of Nations. The whole of the advantages or disadvantages of different employment of labor and stock must, in the same neighborhood, be either perfectly equal or continually tending to equality. If in the same neighborhood there's any employment evidently more or less advantageous than the rest, so many people would crowd into it in the one case, and so many people would desert it in the other, that its advantages would soon return to the level of other employments. Is that point clear? I mean, you know, there's a high wages being paid over here and low wages being paid over here in the same neighborhood. Then people are going to crowd into the high wage, bid down that wage, and they're going to crowd out of the low wage and decrease the supply and bid that up. This is at least would be the case in a society where things to follow their natural course, where there was perfect liberty and every man was perfectly free to choose what occupation he thought proper and to change it as often as he thought proper. And then he goes on to talk about Europe and so on and so on. The same argument is then applied in Smith to actual market prices as opposed to wages. I'm quoting, the actual price at which any commodity is commonly sold is called its market price. It may be either above or below or exactly the same with its natural price. The natural price is, as it were, the central price to which the prices of all other commodities are continually gravitating. Now that's a clear statement from my point of view. It doesn't say that they're equal. It says that the natural price is an attractor, the gravitational center. Different accidents may sometimes keep them, i.e. market prices, suspended a great deal above the natural price and sometimes force them down even somewhat below it. But whatever obstacles which may hinder them from settling in the center of repose and continuance, they are constantly tending towards it. So how do we understand this notion of gravitation? It's not to be understood as a point where they all come to repose and continuance, because the very forces that bring them there set into motion other forces that move them or other things away from it. So it's a constant process of movement towards, movements away, and gravitational in a turbulent sense. Now in Smith, this point is not dwelt upon very much. He just says that they're gravitating. And this, the last point is that Smith makes the point, and this is important for other considerations, that there's a distinction between cost and profit. Cost, as he defines it, comprises the prices of materials and the wages of the workmen, while profit is a difference between price and cost. And the fact that actual profit is turbulently regulated over the long run by natural profit does not mean that profit is a cost. It's only much later, really in the marginalist revolution, that they began to take the idea of profit and make it, of natural profit, and make it into a cost. Smith says market prices will fluctuate around a moving center of gravity, which is the price of production. The price of production has a natural profit, i.e. a profit which gives you a normal rate of profit. That natural profit is only achieved through the gravitation. It doesn't exist as such. But later, in the rise of neoclassical economics, the natural profit becomes a profit that you deserve. It becomes a deserved profit, and that is added on to cost to create what is called an expanded version of cost. So it's something I'm going to come back to, but, and I talked about it before, the cost curve in neoclassical theory is not a cost curve. It's a cost plus profit curve. So in Smith's sense, it is a natural price curve. In Marx's sense, it's a price of production curve. It is cost plus an amount of profit that would give a uniform rate of profit at every level of production, which is kind of a bizarre notion of cost, because it implies that the whole purpose of making money is sort of taken away because you can count it as part of your cost, the profit that you deserve. I've been telling the new school that I deserve a certain profit, but they haven't been listening to me. I don't know, maybe I should get them to read neoclassical economics more carefully. Now Ricardo's version of competition is very similar to that of Smith. Competition equalizes wages, profit rates, and rents, and enforces the gravitation of market prices around natural prices. Again, reading from Ricardo. This is from Ricardo's text. And he says here, whilst every man is free to employ his capital where he pleases, he will naturally seek for it that employment which is the most advantageous. He will naturally be dissatisfied with a profit of 10% if by removing his capital he can obtain a profit of 15%. This restless desire on part of the employers of stock to quit a less profitable for a more advantageous business has a strong tendency to equalize the rate of profit for all, or to fix them in such proportions as may, in the estimation of other parties, compensate for any advantage which one may have or appear to have over the other. So he's not even saying that profit rates are equalized. He's saying the differential among profit rates will be such that it's not paid to move into that industry or away from it because it's compensating for some characteristics. For instance, typically risk is a characteristic. So it doesn't imply profit rates are equalized. They're equalized subject to the degree of risk or other disadvantages or advantages. Okay? But clearly implied here is that there is, adjusting for risk and disadvantages, a tendency for profit rates to be equalized. If you have any questions as I go along, please let me know. But this, he says, does not imply that market price is equal to natural price. Quoting, we must not be supposed to deny the accidental and temporary deviations of the actual or market price of commodities from their natural price. In the ordinary course of events, there is no commodity which is not subject to accidental or temporary variations of its price, subject to market price. So he says that market price will not be much above or much below its natural price for any length of time. And that's an important statement. In the same way, however much the market price of labor may deviate from its natural price, it has, like commodities, a tendency to conform to it. So again, here you have market price conforms to natural price, which is another way of saying market profit rate conforms to the natural profit rate. And on the other side, the wage rate, market wage rate, conforms to the natural wage rate. So there's some sense of a normal wage rate and a normal profit rate, which they call natural. Now when we come to Marx, we see these concepts examined in much more detail, more complexity, and more severely, so to speak. But the essential points are very similar. First of all, Marx insists that all firms set their prices. As he says, the owners of the commodities must hang a ticket on them before their prices can be communicated to the outside world. Now, you know, when you hear this for the first time, it's startling if you've studied orthodox economics, where the market price is something given to the firm independently via. And he's saying here, well, how do you know what the price is? Look on the price tag. That's where the price is. Who puts the price tag on? The seller of the commodity. How else are you going to know, as a consumer, what the price is? Secondly, the point he makes is that firms constantly try to reduce their prices in order to gain an edge on their competitors. And this is, again, an important point, as we'll see when we come to neoclassical economics, where the firm is assumed to not do anything. The firm is a passive firm rather than an active and aggressive one. The third point is that the purpose of capital, the very intrinsic genetic purpose in the social sense of capital, is to use money to make more money. M, C, M prime. But that is a process which is inherently conflictual because it brings you into antagonistic relation with other capitals. Obviously, if you're trying to make money and they're trying to make money, you're basically feeding from the same spot and you're going to collide with them. So it brings you into an antagonistic relationship with other firms. But it also brings you an antagonistic relationship with workers because, of course, you can make more profit by squeezing down the M part of it, by reducing wages. It also brings you then into an antagonistic relationship with the sellers of other commodities, which are other capitals, because if you can cut the price at which you buy things, you can make more money at which you can sell things. And vice versa, they'll do the same to you. From this point of view, competition is, I quote, the action of the many capitals upon another. It is nothing other than the inner nature of capital, its essential character appearing in and realized as the reciprocal interaction of many capitals with another, the inner tendency as an external necessity. Now that's a very Hegelian phrase, but you get the basic point. These capitals are acting on their inner nature, and competition is the externalization of this inner nature in the form of conflict between the capital and workers and other capitalists, including financial capitalists. These collisions are inherently antagonistic in nature. Marx says, competition is, I quote, the war of all against all. That's a definition of competition. In this ongoing struggle, I quote, each individual capital strives to capture the largest possible share of the market and to supplant its competitors and exclude them from the market. Competition of capitals. Now notice how every one of these phrases contradicts the vision of competition in neoclassical theory. Firms set prices. Firms strive to capture market share. They strive to supplant their competitors, strive to keep them out of the market. This is the competition of capital. It's a war of all against war. So the proper analogy for competition, I've always argued, is war, not the ballet of orthodox economics. Here again, quoting from Marx in volume 2 of Capital, if one produces more cheaply and can sell more goods, thus possessing himself of a greater place in the market by selling below the current market price or market value, he will do so and will therefore begin a movement which gradually compels the others to introduce a cheaper mode of production, and one which reduces the socially necessary labor to a new lower level. Clear point. If you can sell more cheaply, you will gain share, you will force to match or die or get out. And in the process, you'll set into motion other attempts to get new technology and so on. So this is inherent, is the incessant drive for technical change to lower costs. The battle for competition, Marx says in Volume 2 of Capital, is fought by the cheapening of commodities. Again, Marx, like the classicals, and as businesses defined costs as the sum of materials, depreciation, and labor costs. There's no component of profit in cost. The interest rate appears in an interesting way because Marx says that whereas profit to any individual capital is a thing that may or may not appear. You go into business, maybe you'll lose money, maybe you'll make money, maybe you'll make a lot of money, but profit is not guaranteed to you. However, the interest rate as a buyer, that is to say as a borrower of money, is given to you from the outside because it's fixed in the market. So the interest rate appears as a thing fixed, I'm quoting, the rate of interest is a thing fixed daily in its general or at least local validity, a thing which serves industrial and mercantile capitals even as a prerequisite and as a factor in their calculation of their operations. So while the profit rate is a mysterious and achieved only through turbulence, the interest rate appears on the surface to be something which is available to all at a certain fixed rate, at a given rate. Now here, this raises an important point in Marx. Your measure of your success is not your profit rate, but the excess of your profit rate over the equivalent interest rate. Because you could have an interest rate. If you use it actively, you could have a profit rate. That profit rate might be below the interest rate. It might even be negative. But the measure of your success is the degree to which your profit rate is above the interest rate. And this means that what Marx calls, so Marx's conclusion is that profit can be broken into two parts. What he calls an interest equivalent, representing the fruits of the ownership of capital as such. So if you have capital, the interest rate represents sort of the fruit of ownership as such. And then there's a remainder, which he calls profit of enterprise, which appears to the capitalist, I quote, as the exclusive fruits of the function which he performs with that capital. In other words, the interest rate is the passive component of capital as such. The profit rate is the active component, and your profit rate has to be higher than your interest rate for your justifying the active use of capital, ex post. Now, obviously, capitalists go into it expecting a profit rate higher than the interest rate because otherwise there wouldn't be any point. It doesn't follow their expectations are valid. But in practice, if the average profit rate is not higher than the interest rate, that means that capital is in a very bad situation. If it's a long time, then capital as a whole, accumulation as a whole, would contract it. So here's, again, a central point implicit in this, which is that the rate of accumulation is going to be a function of the profit rate minus the interest rate. Not in the immediate sense, but in the sense of a continuing gap. That gap has to be positive. Because if it's negative, then accumulation will be negative also. The growth rate will become negative, so capital will decrease in its quantity. This is the rate of accumulation, by which I mean the change in capital over capital. One of the points that Marx emphasizes here is that the movement of capital from one sector to another is in response to profit rate differentials, but the effect, as Ricardo and Smith point out, is on market prices. The variable which does the adjusting is market prices. Prices have to go down to make the profit rate lower. They have to go up to make it higher, and that is caused by changes in supply relative to demand. So it does not require demand to be a fixed curve, and certainly it requires supply to be moving, but it requires supply to be moving relative to demand. And if that's the case, you're talking about a dynamic process. Now, it may be that we can say we can't formalize it in the algebra that we have, but that doesn't prevent capitalism from doing it. That just tells us that we're not any good at formalizing it. And one of the things that I find astonishing is that people who think that because they cannot formalize something, it doesn't exist. All that says is that you can't formalize it, not that it doesn't exist. And I'm quoting from Marx in a quote very similar to Ricardo: capital withdraws from a sphere with a low rate of profit and invades another, which yields a higher rate of profit. Through this incessant outflow and influx, it creates such a ratio of supply to demand that the average profit rate in various spheres of production become the same. Is this point clear? So this is a thematic consistency in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, though they describe the degree of this gravitation in different terms. Yep.
Would market prices adjust when there is a change in the size of the demand but supply remains constant, or only the market share?
Always. Always. Market price adjusts to demand and supply. So let's suppose you have equal rates of profit, right? And then suddenly the demand for some product rises. The market price will rise. Now you have a higher profit rate here than here. Capital responds by moving into here and changing the supply. And that brings the market price down. So the answer is the market price responds to demand and supply. But supply responds to the mobility of capital. And broadly speaking, if you're expanding, demand responds to growth and mobility of capital also. So these are not separable entities. One of the difficulties of formalization with the level that we have of formalization is trying to explain this organic process where movement of capital expands supply, but it also changes demand. Because as you move into the sector, you demand more materials that you need in this sector, you demand more labor that you need in this sector. So these things are all operating at the same time. Now here Marx makes a very interesting remark, which is similar to the full cost pricing hypothesis of Hall and Hitch, if you're familiar with the Oxford Economic Research Group, but it's also sort of related to the idea of markup pricing. He says, experience shows that if a branch of industry yields unusual high profits in one period, and it makes very little profit or even suffers loss in another, so that in a certain cycle of years, the average profit is much the same as in other branches. And capital soon learns to take this experience into account. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying just because you have high profits in one period doesn't mean you will always have high profits, because the mobility of capital is going to erode that. So high profits tend to be followed by low profits, and low profits tend to be high. And in sort of cycle of years in which the average profit is achieved. So already that's saying this equalization process involves years. And so the whole notion that you can reduce it to sort of static equilibrium makes no sense, because it has a real process behind it. This is one of the reasons I've always opposed any idea of long period equilibrium as a descriptor rather than as a convenient analytical thing. It's not a descriptor because there is no such thing as a long period equilibrium. It's our method of analyzing, holding all the things that we can't analyze out of the way by saying, let's look at what it would look like if profit rates are equal. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you fool yourself into thinking that that represents actual existence of capitalism, then you've lost the whole process in the thing. Now he comes to that second part. He just said here that capital soon learns to take this into account. He says, as soon as capitalist production reaches a certain level of development, the equalization of different rates of profit in different spheres to the general rate no longer proceeds solely through the play of attraction and repulsion by which market prices attract and repel capital. After average price and their corresponding market price become stable for a time, it reaches the consciousness of the individual capitalist that this equalization balances definite differences so that they include them in their mutual calculation. Now what is he saying here? In effect saying that after a while, capitalists start to set their prices taking into account the expectation of a normal rate of profit. Now, is that not the same thing as the neoclassical idea that costs include normal profit rate? It's closer to the idea that they set their prices with a profit margin that gives them the profit rate that they think is normal in the industry. So already they're price setting within a profit margin. But it doesn't follow, and this is important, that they can keep the profit margin that they think they get, because they may be wrong. And in fact, at some point they will be wrong because there's constant change going on. And so the profit margin that used to be normal in automobile industry in the 1970s in the United States is not normal now because new automobiles came in elsewhere. So the idea that this looks very much like markup pricing. In fact, he's saying that they create a markup on their price. But he's not saying that they can keep the markup. He's saying they create the markup that they think is sustainable, and then competition forces them to realize whether or not they were right. Competition vets them. So the markup is, I prefer to think of it as a trial markup. Whenever you set a price in the market, you're setting a trial markup. Whether you do it by adding costs and a trial markup, or you make a trial price, which is an implicit trial markup. The point is that it's trial, and therefore competition is what establishes whether you can prove it or not. And this is precisely why so many firms go out of business. You set a price or a markup, and nobody comes, and then you have to close up. Okay, is this point clear? Because it's going to be obviously linked to the idea of markup pricing in Kaletsky, and in structuralist economics, and in Taylor, and so on, Godley.
Could you say a little bit more about the relationship between what the general rate and the rate of production? Is there a tendency?
Rate of production meaning output?
Rate
Or
of
price of production?
the profit that I get from the potential higher profit I get from investing in production versus just having my capital stand idle and getting the general rate. What is the relationship? Why are those? I imagine those two also to be like gravitating around some kind of center, or are they in a constant kind of disequilibrium?
Okay, so let me do it in two steps. It's a very good question. Let me do it in two steps. Let's for the moment say that the interest rate is given to the individual capitalist, because individual productive capitalists, because it's given by financial markets, right? So they shop around from one bank to another, but they have their daily reading, so to speak, because interest rates are published. Interest rate is kind of a price. It's like a price of raw materials, in this case, a price of finance. Now I want to come back to what determines that. So individual capitalists obviously will not invest unless they expect the profit rate, so it's the expected profit rate over the interest rate, which determines their investment. But over time, they have to assess whether the expected profit rate is in fact related to the actual profit rate. Because you can expect anything you want and be wrong, so you have to adjust your expectations. So there's an inner relationship between expectations and the actual rate. And this is the difference between Marx and Keynes. Marx, like Keynes, or rather Keynes, like Marx, argues that the expected profit rate is what motivates investment. Different, all the classical economists say expectations are ultimately judged by competition. In fact, the actual profit rate is negative. You could have expected and put a lot, it happens all the time, put huge money into, and you end up losing money, and you close down. That means that you change your expectations. And so if we're going to formalize it, you have to have some idea of how expectations react to actuals. And I found in writing this book, about 5 or 7 years ago, I ran across Soros's argument about reflexivity. And the reflexivity argument essentially says that there are three things going on. If you expect the market price of a stock to go up, if you do it on your own, it doesn't have any effect. If a sufficient number of people expect to go up, they buy the stock and the price will go up. So expectations affect actuals, right? So a expected price rising, actual price rises. In the same way, if many capitalists expect high profit rates, they invest. They create a boom in this process. So if from that point of view, expectations are running the show. But Soros's second point is, if the market price is above sustainable level, the fundamentals, then as you get away from that, more and more capitals will realize that it's not sustainable, and at some point they will leave, or competition will force the actual price down a level below what you thought, and you have no reason to stay there, and that forces the expectations back into relation to the fundamentals. So Soros expects this process to be a series of deviations, long or short, depending on the type of market, from the fundamentals. And that's exactly what they're talking about here. And in other places you can see them. They say, well, of course, you invest. You don't have an actual profit. You're making a guess. Now, the interesting point is that Keynes says the same thing, except that Keynes never gets back to this part, because he's talking about the short run. And he says, well, that's in the long run. I'm not going to deal with that. So in the short run, it's run by your expectation. Animal spirits. The key point in talking about Keynes is whether these animal spirits are in your head or whether they are your head in relation to reality. And that's a divide between the classical tradition, and Soros for that matter, and the Keynesian tradition, most of it. Other places Keynes says, well, difficult to parse because some places he leaves it hanging in the air and other places he links it to the marginal product of capital. But really, if you're following the classical tradition, the expectations cannot be in the air. They create some conditions which would generally falsify them in the form of a cycle. Is that point clear? Now the second question, which I'm going to come to in a subsequent lecture, is what determines the interest rate? In Keynes, for instance, the interest rate is dependent on subjective preferences. Neoclassical theory, it's also expectations and subjective preferences. And this is very odd because the price of a commodity is not based on subjective preferences, but on costs. So how is it that interest rates, which is after all a price of finance offered by a business that's making profit, how is that based on subjective? And that's because Keynes adopts the neoclassical idea that money is lent by individuals who are not capitalists. So it's all based on your expectations and so on. But just as firms make expectations about commodity sales and all that, and then they vet them in according to competition in relation to your costs, if you leave out the cost component from interest rates, you have nothing but expectations. But once you bring the cost component in, who lends money? Banks or money market firms. What do they lend it for? Well, they want to make more money than it costs. Then their cost becomes exactly like a cost of production. I call it a cost of provision of finance. And then competition will make their profit a normal profit. But their profit on what? They have an interest rate minus their costs, which is their profit. If they have a normal profit, then the interest rate is determined by profit rate equalization. That's a central point. It cannot be determined by expectations in the long run or subjective preferences in the long run, because profit competition will make an interest rate which will give a profit rate to the lender, which is the same as anyone else. That's perfectly consistent with the interest rate being smaller than the profit rate. That's a separate issue, and I'll elaborate on that. So here you have a better way to think of it. The interest rate is the price of finance. And the price of production of finance is that interest rate, which will give the banks a normal profit rate. And this is relevant because Smith says something like this, Ricardo says something like this, Mill says something like this, and Marx also says something like this, but all of these something like this are scattered. And in Marx's case, buried in volume 3 of Capital, where he says it as an aside. And at sometimes he seems to say that, other times he seems to contradict that. But for me, it's pretty clear that the logic of competition requires all competitors to be constrained by this profit rate equalization, which means that all prices are subject to that. And that means that interest rate, which is the price of finance, must also be subject to that. Okay, I'm going to spend some time on that and the empirical implications and its application to stock market prices and so on. Let me give you another example of this in anticipation. In orthodox theories of the stock market, some orthodox theories, the idea is that you invest in stocks according to your preference. You have a portfolio preference, and some people are, fundamentals, and others are short run. And so stock prices depend on the balance of your preferences and various other rules. But then from the classical point of view, that cannot be true. Because if you, in this side of the room, have preferences for some kind of stocks pricing and it creates a high profit rate, and then this side you're long-term investors and you're not really jumping into stocks so the profit rate is low, then there are financial capitalists whose job it is to take account of that difference and move more capital into here. They will top off the subjective and individual preference structures to equalize profit rates. So they will flow more rapidly, and they don't care about anything else except the profit rate differential. In modern finance theory, these are called arbitrageurs. But arbitrageurs is another way for saying capital movements from one section to another. In the same way, if the profit rate is higher in the finance sector than it is in the real sector, capital will flow there. Vice versa if it's higher in the real sector. So you would expect the financial rate of profit to be equalized to the real rate of profit. And I will show you that's exactly what happens. Okay? But that's several lectures down the line. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, and if you're going to get to it later, then that's fine, I guess. And I might have missed it, but what determines the cost of finance? What determines the cost of provision?
Okay, good. So think of a bank. right? So a bank is a provision of finance. Let's suppose it's a simple bank and just gives you short-term loans. Well, you need a bank plant and equipment. You need machinery. You need workers. You need paper, computers, all of that. That's just costs, operating costs, that's all. When you're set with all of that, then clearly, as you push out these loans, which you sell at an interest rate, you're making profit, dependent on the amount of your loan and the interest rate. But the amount of your loan is linked, costs are linked to the amount of loan because you have the bank, which is your fixed capital cost, and then you have operating costs, more loans, more people, more paper, more computer use. And that's how banks actually operate. You go to the balance sheet of a bank and you can see that relation. So the bank has a cost just like any other producer. Its output is not a physical good, it's finance, but it's just the same. It's not different from a service producer, by the way, you know. And, yeah. And to me, this was a very important point because it helped me unify the theory of finance and production under the same thing. But it wasn't my idea, and I will give you the citations and all that. I'm the first person to do it, and I just blanked out, but it'll come to me when we're talking about it in the lecture on finance. You'll see. Very interesting book, which I will recommend. Okay. Now here, yes?
On that point, interest, the Middle Ages, you could have interest rates at 30 or 40% because of risk built into it, with no reference to necessarily infrastructure or cost. Monopolizing the money would give you monopoly profit on interest in many situations, independent of cost. So how can you finally reduce interest to a cost of?
Well, first of all, we're talking about industrial capitalism. So this is not meant to be a situation in pre-industrial capitalism where costs played a big role. But secondly, I don't believe, in fact, that was true just because the interest rate was high, it was a monopoly. Because you can look in those periods, you see many competing houses, who, by the way, hated each other and were killing each other in opera just as they were in real life. And their interest rates were, in fact, subject to a variety of local factors, including risk. I mean, if you're sending money from Venice to India and back, you're going to be talking about a huge risk involved.
Okay, well, discounting risk, which I think you made a point there. This still is an element of coercion, monopoly, by holding funds. It's like a rent in a way. You can hold out for more than your cost because you've got bargaining power that's asymmetrical with it.
I don't think so, unless you're the only provider of finance in the whole world. As soon as you have more providers, I don't think so. I don't think rent, by the way, is a monopoly. We've had this discussion before. Rent is not a monopoly result. It's due to the fact that you can't expand the supply of land. But Ricardo's central point, and Marx and everyone else, is that rent is actually a competitive outcome. So in that same sense, you can apply that. But you'll have to wait because I'm going to come to the idea of finance. I'm going to look at the empirical evidence. Do banks get profit rate equalization? And I'm going to show you that they do. Not in the sense of equality. Of course, every bank wants to be the monopolist. But why do banks go out of business then? Because not everybody can be the monopolist. Okay, so now I want to emphasize here a point that Marx makes, which is that when we're talking about the equalization of market prices by what he calls prices of production, he is not talking about equilibrium. So let me read you this quote from Marx. The determination of market price by the price of production is not to be understood in the sense of the economists. The economists say that the average price of commodities is equal to the price of production, that this is the law. This anarchic movement in which the rise is compensated by fall and a fall by rise, which looked at more closely, brings with them the most fearful devastation and, like earthquakes, causes bourgeois society to tremble in its foundations. It is solely in the course of these fluctuations that market prices are determined by the prices of production. The total movement of this disorder is its order. It's a very important phrase. The total movement of the disorder is an order. This is Adam Smith's idea that the order is achieved through disorder. The invisible hand doesn't lead you to an equilibrium. It leads you to a turbulent process in which a pattern emerges because it channels things. But that is not, in any sense, a state of bliss that is called equilibrium in the modern lexicon. The fluctuation of profit caused by the cycle of fat and lean years succeeding one another in any given branch of industry must receive due consideration. So again, this is a process of fat and lean years. The average periods during which fluctuations of market prices compensate each other are different for different types of commodities, because with one kind it is easier to adapt supply to demand than the other. Again, an important point. How long does it take for profit rate equalization? Well, in some sectors it's longer than others because it takes more time to enter and produce a commodity. If it takes you 20 years to grow trees or make a good wine, it's obvious that that process of adjustment is going to be much slower than the time it takes you to set up a bakery, open a shop, and get your baked goods going, right? And that difference therefore means slower adjustment for capitals where the entry is more difficult and the time of production is greater, than where it's easier to enter and where it's shorter. But that doesn't imply lack of competition. That's only the specifics of competition. It's the concrete factors involved. So we would not have to, we cannot expect that if we take a sample of 1 year, we'd see equal profit rates. Maybe in you produce or steel mills or big tankers. So you have to be aware of the concrete supply conditions, supply forces. He says, when you look at this concretely, you see, I'm quoting now from Marx, all of this involves a very complex movement in which, on the one hand, the market prices in each particular sphere, the relative prices of production of different commodities, the position with regard to demand and supply within each individual sphere. And on the other hand, competition among capitalists in different spheres plays a part. And in addition, the speed of the equalization process, whether it is quicker or lower, depends on the particular organic compositions of different capitals, i.e. more fixed and he says more fixed or circulating capital, for example, and on the particular nature of their commodities. That is, whether their nature as use values facilitates rapid withdrawal from the market or the diminution or increase of supply in accordance with the level of market prices. These are some of the reasons why the general rate of profit appears as a hazy mirage. The general rate of profit is never anything more than a tendency of movement to equalize specific rates of profit. All right? Confuse this as the actual process. There is never a normal rate of profit in any sector. There's never a general rate of profit. There's only the incessant movement towards higher profits and away from lower profits. Now, I've already talked about regulating capitals and the difference, and I'm going to try to speed that up a little bit. Just make the point that Marx makes that the idea of regulating capitals is a generalization of Ricardo's theory of rent. In Ricardo, if you remember, you have good land on the ground near the settlement, but as you use up all the good land, which may be there for a long period of time, so its price of production will regulate the market price, then you may have to move up the hill to another plateau. This land costs more, it has a higher cost, so the price of production is higher. And so what was formerly the regulating cost down here is replaced by a higher regulating cost. Not in the marginal sense, but in the sense of a lumpy, discrete movement. That means the idea of regulating capital is the notion where the supply can be expanded to all available capitals. And that's why this plateau becomes a regulating capital once that's used up. In the same sense, you can apply to industry. If you have a set of technologies in industry, new capital is not going to come in on the old high-cost technology. So right away, they're not part of the regulating capital. It's going to focus on the lowest cost. But the lowest cost may be sometimes not accessible to capital in general. Marx's example gives an example. He says, suppose you have modern technology being used to produce textiles. And you have two types, using the coal power, which is available, or using water power. The water power may have a lower cost because it has the advantage of a free supply in a waterfall. But that cost is not reproducible because there's only one waterfall, and you can't use that. Someone else has got it. So the regulating capital will be the coal-powered plant and not the water-powered one, because a water-powered will be restricted in its scope. It can't move away from the waterfall either. So its size is limited by its access to the water. So it remains suspended above the laws of competition until a new plant comes in which is cheaper, not using water power, in which case the water power goes out. That happened historically, of course. We know that. So the idea of regulating capital is a capital who expresses the conditions which are generally reproducible for new capital. Generally reproducible.
So the cheapest one is generally reproducible.
The cheapest generally reproducible methods. That's the regulating capital.
Sorry, I have a question about this. Marx in chapter 10 talks a little bit on this point, and he says that if demand is very high in one sector, then the firms with the worst conditions can have the regulating capital. How does it? I mean, how is it that it changes from the worst conditions to the best conditions?
Very good question. Very good question. So let me see if I can answer it by talking about the time dimension here. If you take the technology and the supply of capital is fixed, right? Then if demand increases and you cannot increase the supply, then the one who can increase the supply the most will be the regulating capital. And that might well be the capitals with the highest cost because they have excess capacity because they're not competitive. So they match, in this condition, may actually be able to increase the supply. If, however, you allow the time period to be long enough for new capitals to enter, then evidently they will not enter in a high-cost capital. So he's there. This is his famous case of market price and market value, but that's a short run, taking the supply of capital constant. Later, he's talking about the mobility of capital into the sector, which is a longer run process. And then, of course, the regulating capital becomes the one that is the best available. So they are consistent. They're consistent with each other. That's a good question. Now, I want to briefly talk about the idea of what's called choice of technique. It's really how technology is introduced. Following the kind of discussion, and I'm going to skip over more quotes from Marx. I don't want to make this too quotation heavy here, and I have other people to quote also. But you should see so far I've tried to make this general point that it's the lowest cost technology which is the most competitive, because it allows you to set your price lower than your competitors and damages them more than it damages you, which is the whole point of warfare. You don't go in there expecting not to get hit. You expect them to suffer more damages than you do, right? So that's a price setting, aggressive price setting firm that we're talking about. And if that's the case, then it's possible for the cheaper method to be a lower profit rate method. It's not necessarily that you'll get a higher profit rate. Let's suppose that you have two firms, one with a low cost and a high cost. The low cost firm could take the price of the high cost firm, and therefore it'll have a higher profit rate. Or maybe that its capital intensity is so much greater, it doesn't even have a higher profit rate. But the point will make it competitive. The thing that makes it enter is the ability to cut prices and damage the other capitals more than itself. I went through this last time in those examples. That implies that the criterion for the choice of technique is lower cost, which is not the same thing as higher profit rate. Lower cost is higher profit margin, because if you have a lower cost than me, then at any price you have a higher profit margin than me. But it's not necessarily the higher profit rate, because your technology may be more capital intensive, much more capital intensive, so your higher profit margin does not translate into a higher profit rate. Nonetheless, if there's a contradiction between those two, it's the lower cost one, because that's the one that will allow you to drive me out of business. And you can do this in a very simple way. You lower your price, and my profit drops, and your profit drops. But you can show, and I'm going to skip this part because of time, you can show that the lower cost producer can always make himself or herself the higher profit rate producer, because there's always a price that you can set that'll make me go to a lower profit rate. And think about that, obviously. Your cost is 60, mine is 80. Right now, my profit rate is higher than yours. You lower your cost to 80, my profit rate is 0, and you're still making a positive profit rate because your cost is 60, so you've got a 20 profit margin. So by setting the price, you can always make the profit rate of the other competitors become lower than yours. And that tells you that you can't judge when the profit rate is higher or lower unless you take into account the tactics and strategy of price setting. Okay? That means that the argument I'm making, which I take straightforward from business literature and also in Marx, contradicts almost all of the discussions of the choice of technique, Occhio, Samuelson, all Sraffians, including Sraffa and Steedman and Sheffold, Kurtz, Salvadori, Sheffold, Dumini, Levy, Foley, etc. All the people who take the theory of competition to be the same in neoclassical economics and classical economics, the criterion to be the same. And that's principally because all of them take the price as something given to the firm, which I'm arguing is completely inconsistent with real competition in practice as well as in theory. Okay? If I have time, I will come back to this issue about what implication that has. But one of the implications is that if lower cost is the criterion for introduction of a new method of production, then it's possible for that new method to lower the rate of profit even at a given wage rate. If you're familiar with the Sraffa, Samuelson, Occhio, and all the neo-Ricardian discussions, they assume that a new method will come in only if it raises the average rate. If it raises the rate above the average rate, in which case it pulls the average rate upward at a given real wage. From this it follows that if the profit rate falls, it's because the real wage has changed. Because it's normally at the same real wage the profit rate would have risen, so a falling rate of profit comes from this contradiction. But in the discussion in Marx, there's no such limit. The lower cost method can lower profit rate in itself. So that's very important. As a filter, if you're looking at choice of technique as a filter, it does not exclude a falling rate of profit from competition. But there's another point. Marx in particular makes a point which is very common in the business literature. And that's not surprising. Marx is studying the business literature when he arrives at these things. So he's not talking about what capitalism should do, he's talking about what it does do. And he makes the following point. He says that lower production costs are generally achieved by larger and more capital-intensive plants. Let me say that again. If I have two firms, let's say this is the average cost, and this is the average fixed cost, which should be below there. Average cost is the cost that give you your competitive advantage. Average fixed cost is the cost of plant and equipment, right? He's making the argument that if you have a new method of production which has a lower average cost, so this is the average cost here, this new one is lower, it will generally have a higher, how do I do it, up here? Yeah, I'm not sure I'm doing this right. Higher fixed cost at the same, at the same level of output. He'll have a higher fixed cost here. I'm not doing this right, sorry. I just blew this, hang on. Yeah, so let me do it on this side here. To lower your average costs, you need to make new plant and equipment. And that new plant and equipment will generally be more expensive. So your average fixed cost will rise. How will your average costs fall? It's because your prime costs, your material and wage costs are lower. In other words, your productivity is higher and your use of raw materials is less. So the movement is one of reducing your average costs and the price you have to pay, so to speak, is getting more plant and equipment tied up. Or in other words, capital per unit output rises is the means of reducing costs per unit output. Now here, let me read you and here it's interesting that Marx is talking about empirical evidence, an analysis and comparison of the prices of commodities produced by handicrafts or manufacturers, and of the prices of these same commodities produced by machinery shows generally that in the product of machinery, the value due to its instruments of labor, i.e. the machines, relative to the total value of a pound of yarn, for instance, increases. So what is he saying there? Methods that produce yarn more cheaply When it's average costs are methods that tend to have a higher amount of fixed capital per unit output. And we talked about this a couple lectures back when I showed you the data from Dhawan and also from the empirical associations with the capital intensity and costs and so on. This is so common in empirical work that some management textbooks, Pratton, for instance, and Weston and Brigham, take this to be a kind of obvious phenomena. How do you lower your costs? You invest in a more capital-intensive technology, which gives you higher productivity, sufficiently higher that your costs actually go down, operating costs, even though your capital costs have gone up, because the other costs have gone down more. Now that is a very important point, because if that's so, there is a negative trade-off in new technologies between unit costs and capital. Unit production costs and unit capital costs. If you have some technology with a unit production cost here and a unit capital cost here, a new technology with a lower, I drew this backwards, never mind. Yes, I drew it backwards, okay. So if you want a lower cost, you will tend to have a higher production costs. Not because you prefer that, but because the technology required to lower your costs to move you this way will also move you that way. So you will have a negative relationship between capital costs and production costs. And that's what I showed when we looked at that large data sample. And also you look at Dhawan's data, which was another large data sample. Yeah.
Today, capital seems to be cheapening at a very fast rate, faster than unit labor costs. So in Marx's day, it was clear. Today, it may not be so clear that new capital is more expensive than old capital, especially with the automation and computerization. That may be not the case now. It's the issue of the falling rate of profit somehow being suspended because of that fact.
Well, I will come back to this when we look at the aggregate data, which we did actually earlier, but I will come back to this again. But it's very clear when you look at the aggregate level that the capital output ratio rises over time in a pretty steady way.
What period of time?
1947 to 2012. So it's a long period. And the reason for that, by the way, is part of the reason people don't see that. I mentioned this point before in the book. I spent a lot of time on it. The way capital is measured was changed in 1988 from national income accounts. And so now when you correct for that, you can see the pattern clearly. Obviously, this is not true for every individual firm. It's true in a stochastic sense. And so that implies that in a stochastic sense, your choice of technique involves a kind of biased space. Lower costs are associated with higher capital output, so your choice of technique is then a kind of space that's shaped sort of this way, with points scattered around here, and that has some implications, which I develop in the book, for the general trends. Using stochastic tools, you can easily show that. Yeah.
You're arguing that hedonic pricing somehow, if you reverse that, will demonstrate your proposition.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Hedonic pricing, they've changed the way that they account for capital. Steam engine was fully costed. A computer, they now say they'll cost it on its output, they'll revalue its cost by its output.
That's right, that's right. So that's a very good point. So one way to think of what the switch took place in 1988 is that Marx in a business says, how much does that plant and equipment cost? Neoclassical economics says, we're not interested in the plant and equipment, we're interested in the quality of it. Well, what is the quality of it? It's output. So therefore, we attach the price, to the price of the plant, the quantity of its quality, which is its output. That means you make the value of capital equal to your estimate of the value of output, which means you make the capital output ratio by definition constant because you change prices between the two to make them the same. Strictly speaking, David Gordon's brother, Robert Gordon, who's the pioneer in this, mentions the point that the quality of a machine should not be viewed as its output, but its profit. So if the capital stock was correctly revalued in the hedonic price index method, then the value of capital should be equal to the value of output, value of profit, which means hedonic prices, ideal pricing is to make the profit rate constant. Now, if you don't know this, you don't know that in 1988 they changed this methodology, which means that since 1988, all the data going back to 1932 or 1942 or whatever, where this starts, is the new methodology. You will never notice that the capital output ratio becomes suddenly constant. You say, aha, a new stage of capitalism. This is very common, especially among the left, a new stage of capitalism whenever the data change. But it's really a new stage of measuring hedonic pricing. And I have a big section in the book about not only how to measure it, how it's done from all these sources, including Robert Garden, but how to then measure capital the other way. And you can do it. They do that too, but you just don't know it. They do it by measuring something called the current cost of capital. And you can take that measure and you can make use of the laws, so to speak, of pricing, and you can create a capital output ratio, which is not subject to the constraint that capital has to be proportional to output or proportional to profit. Then you can see what happens to the rate of profit. Businesses do not use hedonic pricing. This is a national income thing related to the neoclassical idea that the value of a machine is what it's going to give you, not what it's going to cost, what it cost you. And then, of course, the assumption is that the cost will be equal to what it's going to give you. So they replace the actual cost with this discounted present value of its benefits. Its benefit is profit. So then you make the profit rate such that, the rate of return such that those two are equalized. And that's, of course, a constant profit rate, constant return. It's just basically internal revenue arguments, it's present value calculation arguments, in which you make the present value equal to the value of the benefits, which is based on the assumption of a constant rate of return. But that's of no use if you want to actually see how capitalism is doing. That's coming from a different theoretical foundation. I did talk about this, I think, in that empirical section. Okay, I have to move on because I'm not even close to where I want to be. One of the striking things about perfect competition of modern economics is it comes from a reaction to the political economy of the time of Marx and Smith and Ricardo, but especially the time after Marx, when the working classes become very active, and the ideas of conflict are inherent in the relation between capital and labor, the relationship between firms. And this notion is disturbing. It's disturbing to orthodox economics. And orthodox economics then moves away from the idea of analyzing how capitalism operates to analyzing an ideal system, literally called perfect competition. So the first thing that gets lost is the analysis of competition. It's reduced from an aggressive process to a process in which each firm passively supplies what it deems best, and this serves the interest of the consumer. So you get that wonderful notion, which I'm going to come to in a minute, of general equilibrium. The notion of competition is changed. The price-cutting, cost-cutting firm is remade into a passive price taker. And the market movement, whose disorder is its order in the sense of Marx, is replaced by equilibrium as bliss. And that's very clear in the description in that time, and of course in the modern times. The early mathematical economists pretended that they were doing this project in the name of analytical refinement, but they're really doing it in the name of ideological displacement. They're moving away from a vision of a competitive, conflictual relation to a passive equilibrium, an optimal relation. So I'm going to have to skip over Cournot and Jevons. Jevons defines competition in a perfect market as a situation in which all traders have perfect knowledge of the conditions of demand and supply. There's perfectly free competition and implicitly a large number of sellers. Edgeworth in 1881, 10 years later, includes a large number of sellers, infinitely divisible commodities, and unlimited self-seeking behavior. And then Leon Walras in 1874 and 1877 puts all these elements together into his general equilibrium framework. Walras, it should be mentioned, was strongly hostile to Marx and to the notion that capitalism is conflictual. And part of his job in this construction was to represent of freely competitive markets with a different political reading of capitalism. So his represents the most general idealization of capitalism. Now, it's very interesting to see how Walrasian equilibrium takes place. So what's interesting to me prior to that is that all of these developments take place in the worst Great Depression in capitalist history up to that point, which is called the Long Depression of 1873 to 1893. Devastating impact on people, on businesses, on employment, on poverty. And in the midst of this real disaster are sitting the orthodox economists constructing a theory of ideal, perfect, optimal capitalism in which none of this can happen. Or what's that phrase when people come back from war and they have this stress disorder? What is that called? Post-traumatic stress disorder. So modern economics is a post-traumatic stress disorder of the 19th century. It arises from that. And this, by the way, is a very interesting parallel because in the next horrible event of capitalism of that sort was the 1930s, of course. And that in 1930s, not only massive devastation of workers and of firms and employment and output, but in Europe, the rise of the Nazis. So what is the more ideal time to invent the notion of rational choice and game theory? Sitting in the cafes in Vienna as the Nazis are roaming across Europe, while Neumann, Morgenstern, and others are talking about ideal, optimal choice. I find this incomprehensible, really incomprehensible. I can see it as a mental disorder, as I think it's Wesley Clare Mitchell calls this, a kind of rational choice theory is a mental disorder. But it's bizarre that it becomes then the dominant representation of human behavior in these contexts. From another point of view, it's not so bizarre because typically people confronting horrible conditions in the real retreat into some idealization. That's perfectly fine for literature, perfectly fine for poetry, but it seems to me a rather bad way for something that claims to be a science to be proceeding. Now, I need to talk about Walras, and you cannot really talk about Walras unless you watch me wave my hands around, so you have to look up here. First of all, Walras begins by taking a system in which preferences, technology, and initial stocks of capital goods and labor power are taken as given. So everything that produces them, so to speak, and everything that moves them has been taken out of the picture. And that you can already see the great difference between that and a classical notion of these turbulent order through disorder mechanisms growing over time and failing in some places and winning in others. It's obviously takes them right off the table. Then all agents, meaning workers, capitalists, bankers, and everything are assumed to be traders in specific auction markets. And this auction market is managed by an all-seeing auctioneer, the famous Walrasian auctioneer. Signaling begins with an announced market price. So you turn on your computer, Win Godley used to tell me this is how it works. You turn on your computer in the morning, and there's a price for every commodity in the world right on your computer. And what you do is you type in, I would like to buy so much of corn, and I'd like to sell so much of steel. So you type in your orders and your offers. Everybody does that. The auctioneer is receiving all of these, and the auctioneer is saying, oh, corn orders are higher than the corn offers, so I'll have to raise the price of corn. On the other hand, steel orders are lower than the steel offers, so I'll have to lower the price of steel. When you lower the price of steel, it's assumed that the offers will go down, the orders will go up, and vice versa for corn. And in this way, through some mysterious adjustment, simultaneously in all markets, including the labor market, you'll hear a bing, and then all prices are now lined up with all the offers which are now consistent with those prices. That's general equilibrium. Only then are you allowed to trade. Because in the Walrasian story, there cannot be any trading before because there's no way you can guarantee that it'll arrive at the right thing. In fact, there's no proof, even today, of general equilibrium being achieved through an actual process. So you just have to assume it. Well, if you're an economist, what's a big deal? Let's assume it. So you assume it. And in that process, that means that every actual trade takes place in equilibrium only. Those supply-demand curves that you talk about are not the actual movement curves. Their intersection is the only point where you're allowed to trade. And this is a well-known property of Walrasian equilibrium. If any quantity changes, then all of this auction process has to change again, and then you have to wait until you hear that bing saying you can trade, and only then can you trade when your price is such, when your demand is equal to your supply at the price that the auctioneer has worked out. Now, while Ross talks about this as actual process through what he calls tâtonnement, which is groping, so that supposedly this all happens, but that's a verbal statement. There's no process, no way to make this groping process in general equilibrium theory come out right. Because if you change something here, it changes something else there. So the groping is a kind of statement, but not a description of any process. The only description you have is the assumption that all operations take place in general equilibrium, in the land of general equilibrium. Everybody, even from the beginning, Ross was criticized for this story because he said that there is a tâtonnement process, and people would say, oh yeah, how long does it take? And he'd say, let's go back to general equilibrium, because there's actually no way to represent that. There's no uncertainty, no speculation, no mistakes, and no regret. Hence, there is no need for money. Why would you need money? At any moment of time, you just go to the warehouse and pick up the demand that you've been validated on, or produce a supply that you've been validated on. There's no need for money. You just leave it in the warehouse, and everybody comes, takes their allocated share, or adds their allocated supply, and everything is fine. And that's why always in traditional orthodox theory, there's a real problem. There is no need for money, because this is in effect a general barter system, generalized barter. Even today, this Walrasian model is considered the best approach to a study of the nature of complex interrelationships in a capitalist economy, and a valuable pedagogical and analytical device. Now, I want to argue it's complete nonsense. It's nonsense because it reduces the real turbulence and complexity of a real process to a kind of fairy tale, where everybody is happy ever after. Not necessarily for very long, because the after can change, but this is a system of optimal allocation, and is designed, I would argue, to produce a particular ideological vision of capitalism. And it's been criticized many, many times. So the answer, the reason it's maintained is not because it's more mathematical or more elegant. You can easily do that for complicated systems. It's because it gives the right answer. That's the reason. Yeah.
Does it speak to the fact that initial endowments, the value of initial endowments at least stay the same?
Well, Ross assumes that they are given in some form, but since the initial endowments are given in physical terms, the value doesn't matter for him. And this is a typical starting point of exchange theory. When you talk about exchange, you say you have some apples and they have some corn, and then you exchange. They don't talk about the price at all. But the price comes out of the exchange, but it doesn't matter what the price of apples and corns is for you in that level. You end up with a physical endowment changed over to another, but you can value it because the exchange will give you some exchange rates.
Would the value be essentially the same? The aggregate value of the endowments stay the same after the transaction?
No, but you don't have any transactions unless you reach an equilibrium value. So there's only one value, which is equilibrium value. So you've got a whole bunch of things now.
Endowments don't disappear. I mean, the value of those don't disappear. It's not used up in that process, are they?
Yes, they are there. So in the static Walrasian framework, if you have machinery that you want to sell, someone else will buy it. The machinery is still the same, but at the end of the process, so the corn moves from the supplier to the consumer.
Second round of that, what are the initial endowments then?
There's no second round. There has to be a new endowment, because the first round is perfect. There's nothing to be done. There's no actual tâtonnement, because it's impossible to show any process that arrives at the result that you want. I mean, you have to say how fast does it operate, what does it react to, and all of that, and that doesn't work out. So you just assume it. Now, the main point here is this idealization of capitalism and competition as producing the optimal result, because everyone's demand is satisfied and everyone's supply is realized, meaning sold. Right? So both demand and supply are realized in this instant of general equilibrium. Notice also that it builds in not only this idealization of capitalism and competition, but methodological individualism, because each person is either an offer of something to supply or a buyer or both. So everybody is doing capitalists and workers, between landlords and capitalists, matter of what you happen to have. You're all equivalent suppliers of something. The businessman is supplying machinery for you to work with. You are supplying labor power. The landlord is supplying land. It's all the same. It's just a matter of something that you supply. Samuelson says at one point, really capitalism is just the same if you think of workers hiring capitalists or capitalists hiring workers, because in the end it's just a transaction, so there's no difference. One of the things that Ross does is also treat everything in the short run as a generalization of the principle of scarcity. Since you're given the endowment, the price has to reflect the scarcity of things. There's no cost of production here. So, of course, it's a generalization of the idea that the price is a scarcity price. Now, that's not true in the classical tradition. The price is a cost price, which is not the same thing as scarcity. The only scarcity price that appears in the classical tradition is those goods which cannot be reproduced. And remember, Adam Smith and Ricardo talk about this, that if you have, say, a painting from an earlier period, the painter is not available anymore, then the supply of paintings is fixed, and the price of paintings depends on the demand for paintings, because the supply can't change and the cost has no relation then. But as soon as the supply can be changed, the cost becomes a regulating principle of price. Here also cost in Walras is transformed into a normal profit rate, into cost plus a normal profit rate. So the equality between price and costs, between supply and demand in Walrasian equilibrium is the equality between price of production and market price. Only there is no market price except the price of production. The only market price that appears is the identical price of production. Dynamics is then introduced from this perspective as a moving equilibrium. Though in fact there's no process in here, but if you imagine that this process takes place in a split second, then you look another split second, so it's moving over time, and you're never allowed to step outside the prison of general equilibrium. But as moving over time, then dynamics becomes an equilibrium process that is entirely different in vision from the idea of dynamics in which the disorder is the means to the order. Turbulent dynamics as opposed to blissful dynamics. Now, of course, in this process, markets always produce full employment, because by definition, the equilibrium point is where the labor demand is equal to the labor supply. And every commodity is equal to, so everything is equal. Labor is no different than raw materials or machinery. Everything has an equilibrium price, and that price is where the people who wish to supply the product are met by people who wish to buy the product. In the case of labor power, it means the supply of labor power is equal to the demand for labor power at some given price. And that's by definition full employment. There cannot be unemployment. And notice that all agents are literally passive price takers. No supplier does anything except supply a certain quantity at the price which has been told to them as a possible price. And the only time they actually supply is when that bell rings, bing, and then you bring your supply, and that supply will be immediately sold because the bell tells you you have demand at the other side. And so therefore, all agents, buyers and sellers, are price takers. They're waiting for the screen to tell you the price. Right? Now, so this leads immediately to a critical point in neoclassical theory, which is, how do you translate this story into perfect competition? Because in this story, there are no firms. They're just suppliers of things and they're buyers of things. So when you come to the theory of perfect competition, you introduce firms, you have this difficulty. You have to justify the existence of the firms, the assumption that the firms take the price as given. Now this is different because when you have perfect competition, there is no Walrasian auctioneer. He's gone back to Oz. And you are standing there saying, I'm telling a different story now. I have firms. But that story has to come out the same way. But what is that same way? Firms take the price as given, and consumers take the price as given, because that's a key part of the Walrasian story. And here you run into a difficulty. How can you say that firms take the price as given? Who gives it to them? And you say the market. Well, the market is really, of course, an auctioneer, whom you removed from the story and then brought back in through the market. But it's not enough to say that firms take the price as given. They have to be exactly the same, because otherwise they won't react the same way to the price. They have to have perfect knowledge of all relevant circumstances. And so the neoclassical theory of the firm tries to bring back the Walrasian outcome by making assumptions about the firm. It's tiny, it's passive, it takes the price as given, and it serves only its own interest without any consideration of any other firms. And that leads to a rather remarkable notion, because I would argue that that then leads neoclassical theory into a fatal contradiction, which is that firms take the price as given, and they're all tiny, and they're all exactly alike. Now, what's the justification of the firms taking the price as given? What's a traditional justification for why firms feel that the price has to be given to them individually?
Because they're too small to affect it themselves.
Exactly right. The firms are too small to affect the market price through their supply. And so you notice different rationale from Walras saying, if you step out of general equilibrium, I'll shoot you, because you're only allowed to trade when the bell rings, right? Here, you're allowed to do whatever you want, but you behave as if you're in general equilibrium because you believe you're too small. Is that point clear? It's a very important point. But notice, if all of you each believe you're too small, and there's a very large number of you, and you're all identical, and you have perfect knowledge, then you must know that if you get a signal to expand, so will everyone else expand. In which case, it's irrelevant whether you believe you're too small. What is relevant is what the market will do. So the real belief is not that you believe you're too small, it's that you believe you're too small to affect the market price if no one else does anything. On the other hand, if you know that when you increase your output, everyone else is going to do it, you have a super multiplier, then of course the price is going to go down. So it's logically inconsistent to have two things. Firms believing they're too small, that the price is fixed to them because they're too small, and firms knowing that they're all exactly alike because they have perfect knowledge. And indeed, when you put those two things together, one of those two assumptions has to go. And so even if firms all knew they were alike and had perfect knowledge, they could not possibly believe that the price will not be affected when they change their output, because they know for sure that when they change their output, everyone else will change the output. It follows, and this is shown more formally in the book, that a set of neoclassical firms, under the assumptions of neoclassical theory, will operate identical to a single monopolist, because they'll know that they'll move down the demand curve. And that means that the conditions is not price equals marginal cost. It has to be marginal cost equals marginal revenue. There will be no difference, in other words, between a large number of perfectly competitive firms and a single monopolist. And all the theory of perfect competition falls apart on that point. Now, in practice, of course, firms are not exactly alike. But what they do know is that if they expand their output, others will be generally doing that, and they expect that their demand curve, their share of the market, will be a down-the-sloping demand curve. And that's pretty easy to establish. And that's interesting because all the classical economists assume that if you increase your supply, the price will go down. Not because you will cause it to go down, because what you're doing is be mirrored by others. And that has a whole series of implications which I drawn, but the immediate implication is that the theory of perfect knowledge is inconsistent. The theory of perfect knowledge is inconsistent with the idea of a firm that believes it can't affect the price. To put it another way, the rational expectation in a neoclassical firm is that each firm is operating effectively as a monopoly, collectively as a monopoly. So you can't have the two sets of assumptions together. To put it differently, it would be irrational for any firm to assume that its demand curve is horizontal, because it must know that it'll only get its share of the total market curve. So each firm will face a tiny demand curve of exactly the same shape as the market curve, because it has 1/n of the market curve, market demand, and the market demand will go down. When it does something, because everyone else will do the same, so that in fact every firm faces a down-sloping demand curve. And if the firms are coherent in their expectation, they will know this. immediate implication of this is that the concept of rational expectations cannot be grounded in the theory of perfect competition, because perfect competition assumes irrational expectations. So if you have to have rational expectations, you can't have perfect competition. If you have perfect competition, you can't have rational expectations. Those two are inconsistent with each other. Now that has a very interesting implication, which is that obviously it's not necessary to have perfect competition to recognize that firms know that they're only getting a share of the market demand. But now I'm arguing that it is true even in perfect competition. It's obviously true if you have a small number of firms or smaller than infinite number of firms, and that downward sloping demand curves are the natural consequence of firms knowing that if they increase their supply, others will do the same. They're going to get a share of the market, right? And in fact, you can derive it straightforward from taking the aggregate demand curve and the share of an individual firm, and that's your little baby demand curve. I didn't make it to Koletsky, which is a shame. I'll do it next time, but let me make a point with that Keynes, of entry into Keynes. In his actual description of aggregate demand of the firm, he talks about a firm as making a judgment on the expectation of profits. Firms, he says, have to make some judgment about how much profit they make because they have to make a judgment on how much they can sell in the market. The higgling of the market, he calls it. And this is a guess, and it may not be right. But it's been pointed out by people that this is inconsistent with the theory of perfect competition because firms don't make any judgment about sales. They make the assumption they can sell everything they want. Perfect competition means that you sell at the maximum profit any quantity that gives you the maximum profit. So Keynes is inconsistent then with the theory of perfect competition, except that the theory of perfect competition is inconsistent, and it implies that firms must take into account downward sloping demand curves, and therefore Keynes is right to say that firms must take this into account. This becomes important because some economists have argued that Keynes is really inconsistent. He should either take perfect competition, in which firms can't take demand into account, and he says they do, or he should be an imperfect competition, because then they have markup pricing and all of that kind of stuff, and he should be, and one thing we know is that Keynes was vehemently opposed to the idea that his theory had anything to do with imperfect competition. He says, I think it's Leonefoot says, Keynes was adamantly opposed to the claim that competition would take care of the unemployment problem. Was one of his pet hates, because he was not saying that unemployment was due to the absence of competition. He was saying it was due to the presence of competition. And that's very similar to the argument in Marx. Davidson points out that Keynes' theory of aggregate demand does not require any notion of market imperfections. And Chrysler points out that Koletsky's theory of aggregate demand was originally formulated on the assumption of free competition. Now, why am I harping on this? That means that the theory of real competition provides a natural foundation for the theory of aggregate demand. Because firms make their judgment on the basis of expected profits. There's a reflexive relation between expectations and actual, and that is what drives the macroeconomic process. And you can find the root of that actually in the schemes of reproduction in Marx, where firms decide to produce something, then they have to buy raw materials, they have to hire workers, so they create a demand for raw materials, the workers create a demand for consumption goods, firms then decide they want to expand, that's a demand for investment, and they hand out some dividends and the capitalists can consume for that. Every one of those demand elements is derived from expected or actual profitability. So profit rules demand and supply, and that'll be this answer to how you get aggregate demand. There's not a demand side story and a supply side story, there's a profit side story. Profit is on both sides of that equation, but not equally, so that's the process by which you get this turbulent equalization. Okay, so I will pick up from here. I'm going to skip Patinkin and Schumpeter and blah, 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 and get to Koletsky. And after I do Koletsky, I'm going to go to the empirical evidence. Oh, I want to do Marxian monopoly capital theory, so I will do that next week with Koletsky, and then the empirical evidence.
I know that you can see or you've heard all that and you understood it all, but needless to say, important to listen to. And I think you could see in the progression of lectures that he's giving you a much more, it's coherent. I know it may not seem coherent, but actually it is quite coherent. He's providing within the context of his own work the empirical basis for understanding heterodox as well as orthodox, the micro foundations, and of course the second part of this course is to appreciate the fact that it applies, that it's coherent connection to macroeconomic and macrodynamic stuff, and also his fundamental understanding of what counts as a kind of material analysis. And I would assert that particularly, this issue of physics, et cetera, is also, I think, important. And from a materialist point of view, similar but not identical to, when we talk about metabolism, for example. So all those things sort of fit together. And I know you may not want to appreciate that, but at least the material is there for you to play with. So I'm going to end the live stream, and then I'm ending live stream now. This was Lecture 7, Anwar Shaikh. We will do Lecture 8 soon, maybe right tomorrow, but recall that it does take about 90 minutes to get through this darn thing, or maybe